Okay, here we are on ordoabcao.ca. This is the website of the writer and researcher David Livingstone. So I recommend everybody visit this website to dive deep into his work. This is essentially where you can read his book, and it's here presented in 6 parts, and there's also some articles. And right now we're on his About page. Now, I came across David and his work when I listened to one of the recent episodes on the, what's Freeman's podcast called? The Free Zone. The Free Zone with Freeman Fly. I feel like the audio is a little high here. And David appeared, and he had a great conversation with Freeman. And essentially, David's research is all about the history and the purpose, essentially, of secret societies, occult societies, like the Freemasons. So he goes really in depth, and this book has a huge amount of information, and it goes really far back. This is what I'm going to read for you guys in this series. But let's begin here with his About page so we can learn a little more about this book and about David. So David Livingstone, he says, I'm an independent researcher, and this book represents the culmination of 30 years of research. When I attended the Liberal Arts College of Concordia University in Montreal, I read William H. McNeill's The History of Western Civilization, which mentioned the appearance of the so-called Indo-Europeans who emerged suddenly out of the Caucasus and conquered the known parts of the world. The story seemed strange to me. Most nations emerged gradually when they turned to agriculture. These Indo-Europeans had no prior presence in history and burst out of nowhere, and supposedly mastered the chariot, though they came from a mountainous region. As I investigated further, I discovered that the Indo-Europeans was the politically correct term for the Aryan race, and their existence was merely a theory, which I shaped through the influence of the occult, particularly Bible legends of the sons of God of Atlantis, and I learned that these ideas derived from the influence of Freemasonry and also the notorious Illuminati. Though there might be more DNA evidence coming out these days in support of the, at least the Proto-Indo-Europeans. Continuing. However, for the most part, mainstream historians have shied away from investigating what they consider a field rife with cranks and conspiracy theory. These societies typically claimed a fantastic pedigree about themselves, stretching far back into ancient times, and involving history's most famous figures and epics. While some of these assertions might sound outlandish, they were often nevertheless based in an element of truth. I therefore set out to find the truth about their origin and influence. And that's the main purpose of this work, I think, is the uncovering the truth about the origin and influence of secret occult societies. The result is a fascinating version of history which reveals a completely different pattern and significance than has otherwise been taught by mainstream historians. In fact, McNeill's history is propaganda associated with a project from the University of Chicago, funded by the Rockefeller Foundation, which is known as the Western Civilizations course. It represents a Eurocentric version of history inspired by the philosophy of Hegel. Interestingly, the one proof of Hegel's affiliation with the Illuminati was his mention of the Owl of Minerva, the society's symbol, which is also the logo of the Liberal Arts College. Rather, the so-called history of Western civilization as it is taught is inspired by the Kabbalah, which teaches history as an unfolding divine plan, where God is man who comes to know himself. Supposedly, man's intellectual development begins in Greece with the emergence of philosophy, supposedly the first rejection of God, and the first attempt at the independent use of reason. In reality, Greek philosophy represented the first important development of the Kabbalistic tradition, which forms the bedrock of the Western occult tradition, which shaped most of the key events of Western history from the Crusades to the Renaissance, and finally, the Enlightenment, which shaped our modern era. So there he goes and tells you right out. essentially, Kabbalah is the underlying worldview, essentially, to all of these philosophies, societies, occult systems, etc., that have been essentially controlling or directing our culture for a long time. So let's get into it. Let's hop right over to part 1, Babylon, and see how things begin. So this is volume 1 of ORDO ab CHAO, part 1, Babylon. And you can see there's many parts. This volume has 20 parts. There are 6 volumes, and there's around 20 in each. So that's a lot. We'll try to get through as much as possible. And I'll definitely be going, I think, I'll be going beyond the Babylon section today. Don't take my word for it. Let's see. Part 1 might be just Babylon. It might include ancient Greece as well. Let's go. To begin, the dying god. Understanding the cult of the ancient Chaldean Magi of Babylon, the purported priests of Zoroastrianism, is essential to understanding the development of cults and philosophies of the Hellenistic age, and therefore the subsequent history of Western occultism, including Freemasonry and ultimately the New Age movement. However, numerous scholars have disputed the extent of the influence of the Magi in the ancient world, as Zoroastrianism clearly exercised a very limited impact. The puzzle was resolved by Franz Cumont, one of the greatest scholars of the last century, whose research may have failed to have made an impression for the fact that his most important work, Les Mages Hellénisés, or the Hellenized Mage, remains untranslated into English. Cumont's key finding was that the Magi were not Orthodox Zoroastrians, but heretics whom he renamed Magusians, who corrupted their original faith with the Babylonian magic. What Cumont did not note, however, is that the 6th century BC, the period during which the heretical Magian cult was developed in Babylon, was the same period and city where the Jews were held there in exile and developed the Kabbalah. So he's basically saying the Babylonian exile of the Jews, which led to development of Kabbalah, coincided with the, let's say, corruption, he said corruption, of the Zoroastrian faith and the Magi there. So it was kind of like a merging together of different ideas. So Zoroastrianism was essentially being corrupted by a magical system which developed out of Judaism. Continuing. And while conventional scholars dispute their role, it has been openly acknowledged by secret societies who regard them as the source of their teachings. Though largely anachronistic, Morals and Dogma by former Civil War General Albert Pike, Grand Master of Scottish Rite Freemasonry, provided an explanation of the origins of occult history with a level of precision and detail not seen among mainstream scholars, noting that the Illuminati, like their predecessors, the Templars, Rosicrucians, and Freemasons, were all inheritors of the ancient tradition of the Kabbalah by the way of the Magi. So this is from Albert Pike. The occult science of the ancient Magi was concealed under the shadows of the ancient mysteries. It was imperfectly revealed, or rather disfigured, by the Gnostics. It is guessed at under the obscurities that cover the pretended times of the Templars, and it is found enveloped in enigmas that seem impenetrable in the rites of the highest masonry. Magism was the science of Abraham and Orpheus, of Confucius and Zoroaster. It was the dogmas of this science that were engraven on the tables of stone by Enoch and Trismegistus. Moses purified and revealed them, for that is the meaning of the word reveal. He covered them with a new veil when he made of the Holy Kabbalah the exclusive heritage of the people of Israel and the inviolable secret of its priests. The mysteries of Thebes and Eleusis preserved among the nations some symbols of it, already altered, and the mysterious key whereof was lost among the instruments of an ever-growing superstition. Jerusalem, the murderess of her prophets, and so often prostituted to the false gods of the Syrians and Babylonians, had at length in its turn lost the holy word when a prophet announced by the Magi, by the consecrated star of initiation, Sirius, came to rend asunder the worn veil of the old temple in order to give the church a new tissue of legends and symbols that still and ever conceal from the profane and ever preserves to the elect the same truths. Here's a cool illustration of King Solomon. Take a look at that for a moment. I like the illustrations he's included in here, so we're going to definitely give them a moment. Freemasonry is founded on the belief that the teachings of the Magi were adopted by King Solomon, who employed them in the construction of his famous temple. This tradition is denounced in the Quran as follows, from the Quran. When a messenger was sent to them, the Jews, by God, confirming the revelations they had already received, some of them turned their backs, as if they had no knowledge of it. They followed what the demons attributed to the reign of Solomon. But Solomon did not blaspheme. It was the Satans who blasphemed, teaching men magic and such things as were revealed at Babylon to the angels Harut and Marut. But neither of these taught anyone such things without saying, "We are a trial, so do not blaspheme." They learned from them the means to sow discord between man and wife, or love magic. But they could not harm anyone except by God's permission, and they learned what harmed them, not what benefited them. And they knew that the purchasers of magic would have no share in the happiness of the hereafter. And vile was the price for which they sold their souls, if they but knew. In 1856, in Spiritualism, a Satanic Delusion and Sign of the Times, Pastor William Ramsey remarked, "One of the most striking proofs of the personal existence of Satan, which our times affords us, is found in the fact that he has so influenced the minds of multitudes in reference to his existence and doings as to make them believe he does not exist." I'm not sure if David is actually writing here from like a Christian perspective, but it's fine if he is. Just not sure. One of the consequences of the empirical tradition inaugurated by the Enlightenment of the 18th century is a rejection of anything associated with the so-called supernatural. While the possibility of the existence of disembodied entities is ridiculed in Western academia and considered contrary to science and empiricism, belief in such entities throughout human history has been nearly universal. They have gone under many names and interpretations throughout the centuries, including ghosts, goblins, demons, leprechauns, elves, fairies, and in Islam they are known as jinn, popularized in the English language as genies. Most recently, they have also been referred to as extraterrestrials. So essentially just non-embodied beings, spirits. According to the Quran, Satan was not a fallen angel, but belonged to this race of jinn, who were composed of smokeless fire. This perhaps was a reference in the language of the 6th century AD to energy. According to Islam, these jinn are subject to free will and maintain an invisible yet parallel existence to that of human beings. According to Islamic tradition, jinn are capable of numerous abilities, including shape-shifting into the form of a dog, cat, snake, or traveling great distances instantaneously. They can also enter and possess the consciousness of a human being. They are known to listen in on the activities in the lowest heaven and to transmit such information to fortune tellers while mixing into them numerous lies. The Quran recounts that when God ordered Satan to bow down before Adam, he refused, and God therefore condemned him for eternity. However, Satan asked for respite and to be given the chance to corrupt humanity effectively to attempt to prove to God that man was not worthy of his reverence. Here's Cain slaying Abel. Sorry, I'm a little stuffed up. But we can take a moment to look at Cain and Abel here. I think that's what we're about to start talking about. The Kabbalah is purportedly the ancient wisdom transmitted by the fallen angels, referred to in the Bible as the sons of God, who interbred with the female descendants of the cursed Cain. Following their expulsion from the garden, Adam and Eve had two sons, Cain and Abel. Out of jealousy, Cain murdered his brother, and God said to him, "And now you are cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you cultivate the ground, it shall no longer yield its strength to you. You shall be a vagrant and a wanderer on the earth." And Cain said to the Lord, "My punishment is too great to bear. Behold, thou hast driven me this day from the face of the ground, and from thy face I shall be hidden, and I shall be a vagrant and a wanderer on the earth. And it will come about that whoever finds me will kill me." So the Lord said to him, "Therefore whoever kills Cain, vengeance will be taken on him sevenfold." And the Lord appointed a mark for Cain, lest anyone finding him should slay him. Fall of Lucifer here. The Bible recounts that after Abel was unjustly slain by his brother, Adam and Eve had a third son, Seth. Therefore there were two branches that developed to populate the earth. A righteous generation descended from Seth, and another branch descended from Cain, which filled the earth with violence and corruption. According to legend, the race of Cain intermarried with the sons of God. In the Bible, however, the story is mentioned only briefly and fails to state that the sons of God intermarried with the sons of Cain. Their offspring were a race of giants, referred to as the Anakim. Unaware of the story's true significance, translators of the Bible have struggled with this subject and consequently have often translated the size of the Anakim as referring to other qualities. Hence, they are usually translated as mighty men of renown or mighty ones of eternity. In Genesis 6, verses 1 to 4, "Now it came about when man began to multiply on the face of the land, and daughters were born to them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were beautiful, and they took them wives of all which they chose. Then the Lord said, My spirit shall not strive with man forever, because he also is flesh. Nevertheless his days shall be 120 years. The Nephilim were upon the earth in those days, and thereafter too. Those sons of God who cohabited with the daughters of Adam, and they bore children into them. They were the mighty ones of eternity, or Anakim." Some art depicting the flood or the deluge. Very cool. The corruption that filled the earth by the descendants of the sons of God angered God, who caused the flood to destroy humanity, all except Noah and his family, who survived by building the ark. Standard Bible stuff. According to the Bible, Noah had survived the flood with his three sons, Shem, Japheth, and Ham. After a bout of drunkenness, Noah fell asleep without covering himself. When his son Ham came into the tent, he saw his father naked and laughed. His two other brothers, Shem and Japheth, were wiser and entered backwards into their father's tent to cover him. That's interesting. Maybe if Ham had made the mistake, the other brothers wouldn't have been wise enough to avoid the mistake. For his sin, Ham was cursed by Noah, but due to his nearness in relation to him, he placed the curse not on Ham, but on Ham's son, Canaan, and his descendants, the Canaanites. Noah then pronounced, according to Exodus 9, verses 24 and 25, "Cursed be Canaan, a servant of the servants he shall be to his brothers." And here's some art depicting the sin of Ham, resulting in the curse pronounced by his father on Ham's son, Canaan. I like Ham's laughing face here. Funny. However, similar corruption returned to the earth under the reign of Nimrod, the son of Canaan's brother Cush, and the ruler of the ancient city of Babylon, where there took place the failed attempt to build the legendary Tower of Babel. The Bible hints that Nimrod is to be identified with the constellation of Orion, an important symbol of the dying god. The myth of the dying god would come to pervade not only the mystical systems of antiquity, but would transform Western religion and philosophy. Typically, the dying god was a usurper who supplants the original creator god by vanquishing the dragon, who was a leader of a race of giants. The underlying dying god mythology involved the cycle of the seasons. The dying god was a representation of the sun who dies at the winter solstice or Christmas and resurrects at the spring equinox or Easter. Well, that's today. Further festivals were timed with the summer solstice or St. John's Day and the fall equinox or Halloween, All Hallows Eve, or All Saints Eve. The dying god's goddess spouse was Venus, the morning star, though the two were seen as dual aspects of the same deity. The Latin name for Venus is Lucifer. The dying god was universally regarded as the god of the underworld, where he ruled over the spirits of the dead as discarnate entities, were interpreted to be by many early cultures. Sorry, I might have misread that. Here is the Tower of Babel, I believe. The first to recognize the recurring archetype of the dying and rising gods was James Frazer in The Golden Bow, or Bow. First published, when Crowley mentioned this book, I didn't know how to pronounce it either. I should have figured it out. It's first published in 1890, which has had a substantial influence on European anthropology and thought. The focus of Frazer's research was to attempt to discover the source of the ancient religious tradition of the sacred killing of the king. In ancient paganism, the king was perceived to be the living embodiment of the dying god, and therefore the fertility of the land was considered dependent on his health. As the king became frail with old age, the success of crops would become at risk, and it was therefore necessary to execute him to allow him to be succeeded by a more virile heir. Ancient monarchs eventually exercised their influence such that a replacement or scapegoat was put in the king's place for a time and allowed to revel in temporary role until he was himself sacrificed in the king's stead during the annual New Year's festival. A depiction of the constellation of Orion. Good stuff. Nimrod was referred to in the Bible as a mighty hunter before the Lord, which Jewish tradition identified with the constellation of Orion. The dying god was symbolized by Orion, one of the most conspicuous constellations. Lying along the celestial equator, Orion is visible from practically all the earth, in the beginning and end of the year. Therefore, Orion is the subject of many ancient myths and legends, and seems to have been considered the center of the universe. The Assyrian Adad, the Hurrian Teshub, the unnamed Hittite weather god, and the Canaanite Baal all had similar appearances and mythological themes identifying him with Orion. Nimrod was identified with Bel, or Marduk, the chief god of the Babylonian pantheon. The original Babylonian religion was headed by a trinity, Sin, Shamash, and Ishtar. Sin became the moon god, considered to have fathered many children, among whom were twins, brother and sister, Shamash and Ishtar, which became respectively the sun and Venus. In mythology, Shamash, the sun, was the son of the moon god Sin, known as Nana in Sumerian, and thus the brother of the goddess Ishtar, or Inanna in Sumerian, who represented the great star of Venus. In early inscriptions, Shamash's consort was the goddess Aya, whose role was gradually merged with that of Ishtar. So they're like lovers and siblings, that's interesting. In later Babylonian astral mythology, Sin, Shamash, and Ishtar formed a major triad of divinities, which still today plays an important role in astrological systems, though under different names. Ninurta was Saturn, the brother of Mars. Mars was Nergal, god of war, lord of the dead, and god of the underworld. Mercury was Nabu, messenger of the gods, presiding over wisdom, writing, accounts, and patron of scribes and writing. So that's the first or primary triad of gods, with some auxiliary gods as well, coming from the ancient Babylonians. So they were Sin, Shamash, and Ishtar, but they got other names, like under the Sumerians, and as we'll see later, the Canaanites and the Persians have different names for essentially the same gods. And, it also goes on to the Greeks and the Romans, etc. The Anunnaki. Here's a depiction of the sun god, who we just said was named Shamash in Babylonian. I'm not sure if this is Babylonian or Persian art. Nimrod. Nimrod was Babylonian. The sun god battling the dragon of chaos from an engraving made by Ludwig Gruner. The origin of the sacred killing of the king was the Zagmuk, or New Year's festival corresponding to our Easter, that's today, when Babylonians celebrated the death and resurrection of their chief god Marduk, or Marduk, the patron deity of Babylon, also known as Bel. Let's remember that, Marduk and Bel. They're like the big boy god in Babylon. 3 important ceremonies were performed for Bel. So I guess, so they said Sin, Shamash, and Ishtar, but then there's Marduk as well. Okay, kind of above them as the father god. 3 important ceremonies were performed for Bel. These acts of worship were fertility rites, referring to the agricultural cycle of nature with the death of crops in winter and the return of life in the spring, but were also viewed as actually recreating the cosmos itself. In Uruk, the festival was associated with the god An, the Sumerian god of the night sky. Both are essentially equivalent in all aspects to the Akkadian Akitu festival. Okay. Zagmuk, which literally means the beginning of the year, was a Mesopotamian festival celebrating the triumph of Marduk over the forces of chaos, symbolized in later times by Tiamat. As the battle between Marduk and Chaos or Tiamat lasts 12 days, so does Zagmuk. The peak of the festival took place on the spring equinox. First, the Enuma Elish, or Elish, the Babylonian epic of creation, was read, which recounted when the Anunnaki gods gathered together to find one god who could defeat the gods rising against them. Anunnaki, 7 judges of the underworld, the children of the god Anu, who had once lived in heaven but were banished for their misdeeds, are the origin of the numerous accounts of legendary giants, known as the Anakim in the flood story of the Bible, otherwise recognized as the fallen angels or the titans of Greek mythology. So we're starting to see how syncretisms exist across these mythologies. So we have the Anunnaki in Babylon, who are like the Anakim from the Bible, but also fallen angels or titans in Greek mythology. Here's a depiction of the Akitu festival in Babylon. Cool art. Marduk answered the Anunnaki's call and was promised the position of head god. Marduk sets out for battle, mounting his storm chariot drawn by 4 horses. That's very Indo-European, with poison in their mouths, and defeats the leader of the Anunnaki gods, who is the dragon Tiamat, or Chaos. There was a dramatic representation of the conflict between Marduk and Tiamat, during which the god is vanquished and slain, but is raised from death by magical ceremonies and eventually overcomes the dragon. Secondly, the king is brought before the image of Marduk, his insignia are removed, and he is slapped in the face by the high priest. An omen was taken at that point, that if the blow produced tears, the year would be prosperous and vegetation would grow. That priest better slap hard. Finally, in a ceremony known as the sacred marriage, the king, acting the part of the god, practiced ritual copulation with a priestess, symbolizing the union of the god and the goddess. At the festival's end, the king was slain. To spare the king, Mesopotamians often utilized a mock king, played by a criminal who was anointed as king before the start of Zagmuk and killed on the last day. I think that was the scapegoat he was referring to earlier. Here's a depiction of the sacrifice of Abraham, of his son, by Laurent de la Hire, 1650. Promised Land. God's binding offer of the promised land to the Israelites as his chosen people originates in the covenant of the pieces. In Genesis 15, verses 1 to 15, God tells Abraham that he would have a son born to him asks him to count the stars, if possible, and promises, "So shall thy seed be." God commands Abram to prepare an animal sacrifice by cutting the animals into 2 pieces. God then prophesies to Abraham that his seed would be strangers in a land that is not theirs, a strange land, and serve the rulers of the land for 400 years, but afterward they would come out with great substance, and in the 4th generation they would return to Canaan. In Genesis 15:18-21, God tells Abraham that he has given to his offspring the land of the cursed Canaanites and all their descendants. To your descendants I have given this land from the river of Egypt as far as the great river, the river Euphrates, the land of Kenite and the Kenizzite and the Kadamite and the Hittite and the Perizzite and the Rephaim and the Amorite and the Canaanite and the Girgashite and the Jebusite. According to Genesis 22, God also tested Abraham by asking him to sacrifice his son Isaac on Moriah. When God sees that Abraham complies willingly, a messenger from God interrupts him. Abraham then sees a ram and sacrifices it instead. The sages of the Talmud understood this event, known as the Akedah, as an opportunity to teach humankind once and for all that human sacrifice, child sacrifice, is not acceptable. Nevertheless, once the Israelites enter Canaan, following their exodus from Egypt, the Bible recounts that they adopted the religion of their neighbors and practices pagan rituals, which included human sacrifice. Abraham's son Jacob, later renamed Israel, fathered 12 sons who became the 12 tribes of Israel, who were also understood mystically. According to apocalyptic writings and the later generations of rabbis, the 12 tribes were associated with the 12 astrological signs. Like the zodiac, the 12 tribes were divided into 4 camps of 3 and each accorded a particular astrological sign in accordance with the 4 seasons of the zodiac, divided according to the 4 elements. Thus, Reuben, who is compared to running water, with Simeon and Gad, are Aquarius. Judah, the lion, with Issachar and Zebulun, are Leo. Benjamin, Manasseh, and Ephraim, whom Jacob compares to the ox, are Taurus. Naphtali, Asher, and Dan, whose device is the scorpion, synonymous astrologically with the eagle, are Scorpio. Of Israel's sons, Joseph was his favorite, making for him a coat of many colors. Joseph had a dream in which he saw the sun and the moon and 11 stars bowed down before him, signifying that he would be greater than his brothers. Out of envy, they sold Joseph into slavery. He was finally taken by his captors to Egypt, where he became the Pharaoh's chief minister. Stricken by famine, Israel and his remaining sons were forced to migrate to Egypt, where they joined their brother Joseph. After several centuries, the Jewish nation became so substantial that Pharaoh and the Egyptians felt threatened by them. Though God still intended to fulfill his promise to their forefather Abraham, and due to the oppression inflicted upon them, sent Moses to plead with Pharaoh to release the people of Israel. After several horrible afflictions sent by God upon the Egyptians as a sign that they should comply with Moses' request, Pharaoh finally conceded, and Moses guided the Israelites across the Red Sea and north to the Promised Land. So there's some more Bible legend. Here's some art depicting the Adoration of the Golden Calf by Nicholas Poussain. They worshipped the golden calf while Moses was up on the mountain receiving the 10 Commandments because they could not wait. Already before they entered Canaan, the Israelites were guilty of worshiping the dying God in the form of the golden calf. Shortly following the Exodus, and soon after having crossed the Red Sea, while Moses was on Mount Sinai receiving the tablets of the 10 Commandments, the Jews became concerned that their prophet was tarrying far too long on the mountain. Exodus 32:1-4 recounts that they approached Moses' brother Aaron, demanding, "Come, make us a god who will go before us. As for this Moses, the man who brought us up from Egypt, we do not know what has become of him." Aaron advised them to collect their jewelry, and melting it formed a statue of a calf and said to them, "This is your God, O Israel, who brought you up from the land of Egypt." The golden calf recalls Apis, the Egyptian bull god associated with Osiris, who was identified by the Egyptians with Orion, and its accompanying pagan revelry understood to be a reference to the orgiastic rites associated with paganism. When Moses returned from the mountain, upon seeing the spectacle, he smashed the tablets of the Ten Commandments. Moving on to the Baal epic. Here's a depiction of David slaying Goliath. Goliath being a descendant of the Anakim, the giants of the Bible. After the Israelites were liberated from Egypt, God commanded them to conquer the land of Canaan as fulfillment of the promise to Abraham. The frightful appearance of the Anakim, as described in the account of the 12 spies of the Bible, filled the Israelites with terror when they encountered them in the land of Canaan. The 12 spies, as recorded in the book of Numbers, were a group of Israelite chieftains, one from each of the 12 tribes, who were sent by Moses to scout out the land of Canaan in advance of its conquest. The Israelites seem to have identified them with the Nephilim, the giants of the flood story. Joshua finally expelled them from the land, except for some who found a refuge in the Philistine cities of Gaza, Goth, and Ashdod. Thus the Philistine giants, like Goliath, who was slain by David, were descendants of the Anakim. Cool. According to Deuteronomy 9, verses 1 and 2. Hear, O Israel, you are crossing over the Jordan today to go in to dispossess nations greater and mightier than you, great cities fortified to heaven, a people great and tall, the sons of the Anakim, whom you know and of whom you have heard it said, who can stand before the sons of Anak? Similarly, according to Josephus, at that time in Palestine, there were still then left a race of giants, who had bodies so large and countenances so entirely different from other men that they were surprising to the sight and terrible to the hearing. In Deuteronomy chapter 3 we are told, "For only Og, the king of Bashan, was left of the remnant of the Rephaim. Behold, his bedstead was a bedstead of iron. Is it not in Rabbah of the Ammonites? 9 cubits was its length, and 4 cubits its breadth, according to the common cubit." When Moses sends out a reconnaissance team to gather information about the land of the Canaanites, upon their return from the mission they report, "We went into the land where you sent us, and it certainly does flow with milk and honey, and this is its fruit. Nevertheless, the people who live in the land are strong, and the cities are fortified and very large. And moreover, we saw the descendants of Anak there. Amalek is living in the land of the Negev, and the Hittites, and the Jebusites, and the Amorites are living in the hill country, and the Canaanites are living by the sea and by the side of the Jordan." Once they were to conquer the land of the Canaanites, the Israelites were clearly warned to refrain from the pagan cult of the dying god. According to Deuteronomy 18, 9 through 12, "When you enter the land the Lord your God is giving you, do not learn to imitate the detestable ways of the nations there. Let no one be found among you who sacrifices their son or daughter in the fire, who practices divination or sorcery, interprets omens, engages in witchcraft, or casts spells, or who is a medium or a spiritist, or who consults the dead. Anyone who does these things is detestable to the Lord. Because of these same detestable practices, the Lord your God will drive out those nations before you." Okay. Before we continue, here is a depiction of Gideon striking down an Asherah pole, a pagan deity, essentially, statue. Excuse me. However, it was in Canaan that the Israelites adopted the worship of the dying god Baal and his sister spouse Astarte. Sounds like Shamash and the other one, Ishtar. Baal was one of a trinity of gods worshipped among the Canaanites, composed of the father El, his daughter Astarte, and Baal, their son. They were both symbolized by the bull because at the resurrection of the god from the underworld, celebrated at the spring equinox, the sun and Venus rose in the constellation of Taurus. The mythology of Baal is best illustrated in the longest of the known Canaanite myths, the Baal epic, discovered by archaeologists at the ancient site of Ugarit, now Ras Shamra, on the Mediterranean coast of northern Syria. The Baal epic provides the basic account of the dying god as a usurper god, mirroring much of the account of the Enuma Elish, who gains mastery by defeating the dragon of the sea. Remember, the Enuma Elish was the Babylonian epic in which their god Bel, I believe, defeats the dragon chaos, Tiamat. Was it Bel or Shamash? I forget. Shamash. Okay. Baal came to represent the sky god, the god of thunder, who fertilizes the goddess Mother Earth to bring forth life. Thus, Baal was often symbolized as an erect phallus in the form of a pillar. This became the symbol of the single androgynous god, with both Baal and Astarte generally being represented by a pillar, known as an Asherah in the Bible, a Hebrew word also a common noun meaning a sacred tree or pole used in the goddess cult. A priest and a priestess would undergo a mock death and resurrection, and in a rite called a sacred marriage, the priest and priestess would copulate, symbolizing the union of the god and goddess. So yeah, that kind of ritual has continued up through occult societies today. I know like Crowley's OTO does similar copulating rituals. Here's some art depicting the Queen of Sheba before the Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem. The Israelites went so far as to pollute the very Temple of Jerusalem itself with the accoutrements of this cult, including worshipping Asherah poles or phallic pillars. The construction of the Temple of Jerusalem Solomon built, as described in the Bible, was in a manner quite foreign to the doctrines of the Israelites. The Bible maintains that Solomon had sent a message to the king of Tyre asking if he could hire the services of the king's master builder, Hiram, a Canaanite, skilled in geometry. This is Hiram Abiff, famous by the Freemasons. Hiram was referred to as a son of a widow, a term traditionally used to refer to priests of the goddess. 2 bronze pillars, Boaz and Yakin, were erected at the door of the temple, the double pillars sacred to the dying god and the goddess. Temples dedicated to the goddess in Tyre are said to have featured stone pillars of phallic design at their entrances, which were the focus of fertility rites performed in honor of Astarte at her special festivals. Herodotus, a Greek historian of the 5th century BC, described 2 pillars in the temple of a god he referred to as the Phoenician Hercules, meaning the Canaanite Baal. Okay. So this is kind of talking about King Solomon's, I don't want to use necessarily the same words that David is using here, because he says pollute the temple. Obviously that has like an Abrahamic kind of bias to it, I guess. So basically he continued pagan practices or incorporated pagan practices which were forbidden by their god into this religion that they were developing. It's kind of a how do I even say that? It's like a doublethink going on. Okay, Chaldeans. That's where we are. Okay. This art, James Tissot's The Flight of the Prisoners, illustrates Judah's exile from Jerusalem. Chaldeans. After Solomon, the Israelites persisted in their paganism. Political differences divided them between the kingdom of Israel in the north, comprised of 10 tribes, and Judah in the south, composed of the 2 remaining tribes, Judah and Benjamin. Finally, according to the Bible, because of their repeated excesses, the Israelites were punished by being carried away into exile. From the end of the 8th century BC to the beginning of the 6th, the Jews of ancient Palestine were attacked by the Assyrians and deported to Mesopotamia. According to the Assyrian king Tiglath-Pileser, 13,750 of the wisest and most skilled of the Israelites were deported by 733 BC, while 27,290 more Israelite sages, musicians, and artisans were brought to Babylonia by Sargon II in 727 BC. According to 2 Kings, chapter 17, verses 16 to 20, this disaster came upon the nation of Israel because they defied all the commands of the Lord their God and made 2 calves from metal. They set up an Asherah pole and worshipped Baal and all the forces of heaven. They even sacrificed their own sons and daughters in the fire. They consulted fortune tellers and used sorcery and sold themselves to evil, arousing the Lord's anger. And because the Lord was angry, he swept them from his presence. Only the tribe of Judah remained in the land, but even the people of Judah refused to obey the commands of the Lord their God. They walked down the same evil paths that Israel had established. So the Lord rejected all the descendants of Israel. He punished them by handing them over to their attackers until they were destroyed. Finally, between 598 and 596 BC, Nebuchadnezzar captured Jerusalem, sacked the famous Temple of Solomon, and deported much of the remaining population to Babylon. The Jews would eventually remain in Babylon for half a century until their release in 538 BC, when nearly 50,000 of them returned to Jerusalem. Nevertheless, a substantial portion chose to remain in Babylon, where they would continue to be an important community of the Jewish diaspora for many centuries. And now, if you look at my last series of videos about the origins of the Ashkenazic Jews, you will learn that it was actually these Babylonian Jews who remained in Babylon who eventually ended up converting the Slavs and Turks and Persian people who became the Ashkenazic Jews. Continuing. Nebuchadnezzar's capital of Babylon, which at one time may have held as many as 250,000 inhabitants, was the greatest city in the ancient world. According to the Bible, the city was founded by Nimrod, builder of the Tower of Babel, from which it derived its name, and was famed among the Jews and later the Greeks for its sensual living. Herodotus described, Babylon lies in a wide plain, a vast city in the form of a square with sides nearly 14 miles long and a circuit of some 56 miles. And, in addition to its enormous size, it surpasses in splendor any city of the known world. The occult wisdom of the Babylonians was revered throughout ancient times as the special skills of the Chaldeans, a term that originally referred to the inhabitants of Chaldea, but which was eventually understood to refer to the Babylonian priesthood. Their practices were described by Diodorus of Sicily, a Greek historian of 80 to 20 BC, and author of a universal history, Bibliotheca Historica. Being assigned to the service of the gods, they spend their entire life in study, their greatest renown being in the field of astrology, but they occupy themselves largely with soothsaying as well, making predictions about future events, and in some cases by purifications, in others by sacrifices, and in others by some other charms. They attempt to effect the averting of evil things and the fulfillment of the good. They are also skilled in the soothsaying by the flight of birds, and they give out interpretations of both dreams and portents. They also show marked ability in making divinations from the observations of the entrails of animals, deeming that, in this branch, they are eminently successful. Excuse me. To the moon, the sun, and the 5 known planets was given the name of interpreter gods, because, while the fixed stars follow a single circuit, these follow each their own course, and thus, above all others, make manifest to man the purpose of the gods. Worship was also conferred on all the constellations, as the revelers of the will of heaven, and in particular the 12 signs of the zodiac and the 36 deacons, which were called counselor gods. Outside the zodiac were 24 stars, 12 in the northern and 12 in the southern hemisphere. Those which are visible they assigned to the world of the living, and those which are invisible to the world of the dead, and so they called them judges of the universe. The Chaldeans also worshipped the earth, the oceans, the winds and fire, sources of all things, which they confounded with the stars under the name of the four elements. So essentially, these principles started by the Chaldeans, these are the principles that are the foundation of all esoteric occultism, magic today. If you read about Wicca, Crowleyism, Thelema, etc., the Golden Dawn, any sort of high magic, it comes from the Chaldeans here. I mean, these principles eventually develop further into Kabbalah. Also among their beliefs was that the stars were apparently subject to an inflexible law which made it possible to calculate in advance all that they would eventually cause. The Chaldeans perceived the life of the universe as being composed of vast repeating periods. As it appeared to govern the regular movements of the heavenly bodies, the Chaldeans deified time. They conceived of a cycle composed of a great year, wherein the planets were taught to return to their original places. Thought to return to their original places. Thus, they believed that the universe was a living, breathing entity and could be measured in breaths. The basic unit for cosmic time was the Sos of 20 years, then the Nur of 600 years, and the Sar of 3,600 years. A great Sar equaled 21,600 and represented one breath. But as the universe must breathe in as well as out, the entire life of the universe was thought to be 432,000 years. Beyond these is the period of 12,960,000 years. Thus, astrology was closely associated with mathematics, numbers being regarded as sacred. Again, that is another principle that is the foundation of Kabbalah. And that's something we learned in my first reading series where I read the Book of Thoth by Aleister Crowley. Next section is the Seal of Solomon. And this is a depiction of the astrological signs. The Seal of Solomon. Once in Babylon, instead of repenting for their past errors, a faction of heretical Jews insisted that the covenant was binding forever, and that despite the temporary punishment, because they were God's chosen people, they would eventually be restored to the promised land and be appointed rulers of humanity at the advent of their awaited Messiah. This Zionist interpretation was then assimilated to the heretical worship of the dying God, in which the Israelites had persisted for nearly 1,000 years, and for which they were condemned. They were condemned by God, but if we look at it a little more objectively, they were essentially condemning themselves for behavior that they had decided was wrong or immoral, but for some reason could not discontinue. With the further addition of Babylonian astrology and magic, this new interpretation of Judaism would come to be known as Kabbalah. So essentially, there's a Zionist political foundation. This is very ancient politics we're talking about, not modern Zionism. But essentially combining the dying god cult of the Canaanites with magical practices of the Babylonians, Kabbalah was born, of the Chaldean Babylonians. According to the Quran, Solomon was falsely accused of practicing magic by apostate Jews who learned magic from the Satans in Babylon. Talmudic legend has Solomon deceiving Asmodai, the prince of the demons, into collaborating in the construction of the temple in Jerusalem. And we'll jump over to this depiction. This is Asmodeus, as depicted in the Colin de Plancy's Dictionnaire Infernal. Little depiction of a demon right there. According to later Jewish and Islamic traditions, Solomon possessed a signet ring known as the Seal of Solomon, the symbol of a six-pointed star which gave Solomon the power to command demons, or jinn, or to speak with animals. The legend that Solomon possessed a seal ring on which the name of God was engraved, and by means of which he controlled the demons, is related at length in the Talmud. This legend is especially developed by Arabic writers. In one version, the chief of the demons, either Asmodai or Sakhr, obtained possession of the ring and ruled in Solomon's stead for 40 days. The name Asmodai or Asmodeus is believed to derive from Avestan language, Ashma Deva, Zoroastrianism's demon of wrath, where Ama means wrath and Deva signifies demon. According to the Talmud, Asmodai tricked Solomon into unbinding him and giving him his ring, and then threw him 400 leagues away from Jerusalem, and ruled in Solomon's place for several years. When Solomon returned to Jerusalem claiming to be the real king, the rabbis interrogated his wives, who revealed that the impostor demanded to sleep with them while they were menstruating, or to bed Solomon's mother, his mother, Bathsheba. The rabbis thereupon immediately reinstated Solomon, and Asmodai fled off in the sky. Interesting story. Here's the grand pentacle, the Solomon's seal. According to Islamic tradition, when Solomon lost his kingdom, a large number of people and jinn transgressed and pursued their lusts. When God restored to Solomon his kingdom and the transgressors reformed their ways, Solomon seized their holy scriptures, which he buried underneath his throne. When Solomon died, the people and the jinn uncovered the buried scriptures, and the knowledge of magic they contained was falsely attributed to him, to Solomon. This story was related on the authority of Ibn Abbas, the son of Abbas ibn Abd al-Muttalib, an uncle of the Prophet Muhammad, and a nephew of the Maimuna bint al-Harith, who later became Muhammad's wife. Ibn Abbas was one of Muhammad's cousins and one of the early Quran scholars. The seal of Solomon thus came to be seen as an amulet or talisman, or a symbol or character in medieval and Renaissance era magic, occultism, and alchemy. The legend of Solomon's magical knowledge persisted through the centuries, such as the example of the 17th century grimoire, The Lesser Key of Solomon. Ars Goetia is the title of the first section of The Lesser Key of Solomon, containing descriptions of the 72 demons that Solomon is said to have evoked and confined in a bronze vessel, sealed by magical symbols that he obliged to work for him. In demonology, a seal, also known as a sigil, is the signature of a devil, demon, or similar spirit, usually in order to sign a soul away. Though astrology was falsely regarded as an early invention of the early Babylonians, as Bartel van der Waarden has indicated, in Science Awakening 2, The Birth of Astronomy, its emergence should be dated to the reign of Nebuchadnezzar. Before the 8th century BC, as scholars have pointed out, the science of astronomy was basically impossible due to the absence of a reliable system of chronology, which the Babylonians did not arrive at before the 8th century BC. It is only from that time onward that the records of eclipses begin, which Ptolemy used, the oldest being dated to 721 BC. Ptolemy, I guess. But more specifically, those innovations directly related to the cult of the Chaldeans were developed in the 6th century BC. According to noted historian of ancient history Franz Cumont, it may be regarded as proved that this astral religion succeeded in establishing itself in the 6th century BC, during the period of the short-lived glory of the Second Babylonian Empire, and after its fall, when new ideas derived from East and West were introduced, first by the Persians and afterwards by the Greeks, into the valley of the Euphrates. These developments coincided with the period known as the Exile or the Captivity, when the great majority of the Jewish people were in Babylon. While scholars often acknowledge Babylonian influence on Judaism, there's rarely a suggestion of the reverse. However, according to the Bible, Jews had already begun to worship the planets prior to the exile. 2 Kings 23:5 recounts that the Jews offered incense to the sun, the moon, and the constellations, and to all the forces of heaven. Nevertheless, Shaul Shaked, a renowned scholar of Babylonian influences on Judaism, maintains that astrological and other foreign ideas cannot be attributed to the biblical times, but were acquired in Babylon. Shaked noted that it does not seem at all likely that so many similarities could have been formed in parallel independently, and despite the chronological difficulties of the documentation in most of the parallel points, one may feel quite confident that these ideas were indigenous to Iran. Moreover, we know that the Jews in Babylon had become substantial citizens and that some had achieved minor administrative positions. Therefore, considering the size and the prominence of the Jewish population living in Babylon, and taking into account the important role that astrology played in esoteric Judaism and the Kabbalah, it may be supposed that the Jews themselves contributed to many of these innovations. In fact, in the book of Daniel, chapters 2, verse 48, Daniel is made chief of the wise men of Babylon, that is, of the Magi or Chaldeans, and yet remains faithful to the laws of his own religion. A table dated to 523 BC shows the astounding advances in astronomy that were made during this period. For the first time, the relative positions of the sun and the moon are calculated in advance. The conjunctions of the moon with the planets, and of the planets with each other, and their situation in the signs of the zodiac, which appear definitely established, are noted with precise dates. The scientific discoveries achieved in this period enabled the astrologers to predict events with a level of certainty that was unattainable through other forms of prognostication. Therefore, divination by means of the stars became elevated in prestige above all other methods known, leading to a transformation in Babylonian religion. Towards astrology, that is, and magic. Moving on to Zoroaster. The image, or the art here, depicts the state entry of Cyrus the Great into Babylon, 540 BC, from Hutchinson's History of the Nations, 1915. Very cool artwork. I love what David chose to include here. Okay, and we're reading about Zoroaster. Right. Then, in 538 BC, Babylon was conquered by the Persians led by Cyrus the Great. Cyrus released the Jews from captivity, after which many returned to Palestine, where they began work on building the second temple of Jerusalem to replace the first temple, which was destroyed in 586 BC. However, instead of reforming their ways, mystically inclined Jews reformulated the teachings of Judaism by creating what came to be known as the Kabbalah. The Kabbalah is an esoteric interpretation of the Judaic religion which represents the co-optation of the dying god cult, along with elements of Babylonian magic, astrology, and numerology. Great, that's a great definition right there of Kabbalah. I'll say it one more time. The Kabbalah is an esoteric interpretation of the Judaic religion, which represents the co-optation of the dying god cult, along with elements of Babylonian magic, astrology, and numerology. The early Kabbalists were known to the ancient world as Magi, and falsely believed to be the heirs of Zoroaster, prophet of the Persian religion of Zoroastrianism. What's here? Zoroastrianism is believed to have been originally monotheistic, but to have later been modified by its priests, the Magi. Thus, while most religions posit the existence of an evil principle inferior to the good God, Zoroastrianism became the origin of a type of dualism wherein evil is elevated to the rank of a god, equal but opposite to the good, both existing eternally at war with each other. One is Ahura Mazda, the god, lord of goodness and of light. The other is Ahriman, the destructive or tormenting spirit, lord of evil and darkness. According to Diogenes Laertius, Greek scholar of the 3rd century, Aristotle, in the first book of his work on philosophy, says that the Magi are more ancient even than the Egyptians, and that according to them there are two first principles, a good spirit and an evil spirit, one called Zeus and Ahura Mazda, and the other Hades and Ahriman. So they're syncretizing, this is Diogenes, syncretizing Greek gods with the Babylonian gods. Sorry, not Babylonian, Zoroastrian gods, Persian gods. As Yamauchi describes, the relationship of the Magi to Zoroaster and his teachings is a complex and controversial issue. As long as the Persian Empire lasted, there was always a distinction between the Persian Magi, the official priestly class, and the Babylonian Magi, who were often considered to be outright impostors. So essentially you have these Babylonian Magi, who are the Chaldeans, formerly the Babylonian Jews. But when Persia comes in, introducing Zoroastrianism, the Babylonian Magi kind of become conflated with the original Zoroastrian Persian Magi. I think that's what I'm getting here. Essentially, when the Persians conquered Babylon, he's getting into it, the Magi had come into contact with the Chaldeans, whose beliefs and teachings they introduced into their version of Zoroastrians. From the time of Xerxes, however, they began to receive increasing favor at court until the title of Magi eventually lost its heretical connotations. As the French Assyriologist Lenormant noted, to their influence are to be ascribed nearly all the changes which, towards the end of the Achaemenid dynasty, corrupted deeply the Zoroastrian faith, so that it passed into idolatry. The Greek and Latin words for magic, magia and magia, was originally derived in reference to the supposed arts the Magi, astrologers known for having identified the birth of Jesus with the appearance of the Star of Bethlehem. At the time, it was common for mystical literature to attribute their sources to ancient sages and patriarchs. Many such works were attributed to Abraham and Enoch and so on, and are referred to as pseudepigrapha. Excuse my pronunciation there. A number of similar works were attributed to Zoroaster, as well as his supposed disciple Osthenes, or Zoroaster's patron Hystaspes. By the 1st century AD, in his Natural History, Pliny made Zoroaster the founder of magic. I'm not sure if it's Pliny or Pliny. Excuse me with all these people's names. Undoubtedly, magic began in Persia with Zoroaster, as authorities are agreed, but there is insufficient agreement about whether he was the only man by that name or whether there was another and later Zoroaster. What is particularly surprising is that the tradition and craft should have endured for so long. No original writings survive, nor are they preserved by any well-known or continuous line of subsequent authorities. For few people know anything by reputation of those who survive only in name and lack any memorials, as, for example, Apusaris and Zaratus of Media, Marmaris and Arabantificus of Babylon, or Tarmonidas of Assyria. The Magi venerated fire as the symbol of the divine and adopted the Trinity worshipped by the Babylonians, composed of a father, mother, and their offspring, a sun god represented by the sun, moon, and Venus, which they identified with the Persian deities of Ahura Mazda, Anahita, and Mithras. So like the sun, moon, Venus complex is kind of like one thing that it's like different forms of the same thing, the child god of the original mother and father god. They conserved the Chaldean doctrine of pantheism regarding the universe as a single living being governed by a fate determined by the stars. I think I kind of ascribed to that. Astrology was connected to mathematics, and the use of numerology was widespread in their literature. The zodiac of the Chaldeans was divided according to the 4 elements traditionally worshipped by the Persians. They saw the soul as subjected to numerous reincarnations, sometimes into beasts, causing them to abstain from the meat of animals. try it the other way. Pliny transmitted a definition of magic by a famous magi named Osthenes. There are several forms of it, i.e., magic. He professes to divine from water, globes, air, stars, lamps, basins, and axes, and by many other methods, and besides to converse with ghosts and those in the underworld. Though communion with evil spirits was strictly forbidden in the Orthodox version of the faith, the accounts of Greek authors accord in many respects with the doctrines of those referred to in the Avesta and other Zoroastrian literature as a certain people hostile to the Orthodox community called sorcerers, or deva worshippers, or devil worshippers. Therefore, when Roman satirist Lucian wishes to send one of his characters down to the realm of the dead, he resorts to the renowned experts. As I was puzzling over these matters, it occurred to me to go to Babylon and ask one of the Magi, Zoroaster's disciples and successors. I had heard that they could open the gates of the underworld with certain spells and rites and conduct down and bring back up safely whomever they wished. Franz Cumont maintained that the beliefs of these Magusians was influenced by the heretical Zoroastrian cult of Zervan, the god of time. In Armenian texts, Saturn is called Zervan. Orthodox Zoroastrians worshipped the good god Ahura Mazda, who was in an eternal cosmic battle with Ahriman, the evil god. As the greater Bundahisin criticized, the prime object of worship of the false magi was Ahriman. For, by the religion of the sorcerers, Ahriman so inclines men to love him and to hate Ahura Mazda that they abandon the cult of Ahura Mazda and practice that of Ahriman. The worship of Ahriman was partly justified by Zervanism. According to the Zervanite myth, in the beginning, the great god Zervan existed alone, desiring offspring that would create heaven and hell and everything in between. He conceived Ormuzd and Ahriman, who are granted alternating rule over creation. R.C. Zahner commented that in many cases it was more than Zervanism, it was sorcery and deva worship. Zahner continues. The practice of worshipping the demons is also referred to by Clement of Alexandria. The Magians, he says, worship angels and demons. This, as we have seen, in the practice not of the Zoroastrians or Zervanites, but of the devil worshippers, the third Iranian sect mentioned in the Denkart. With these facts in mind, it will perhaps be safe to conclude that Xerxes, in suppressing the Deva cult, caused a large-scale emigration of dissident Magians. These, after absorbing much of Babylonian speculation, transported their beliefs to Asia Minor, and from them arose the Greco-Roman religion of Mithra. Cool. Excuse me. So this guy, Zahner, is essentially saying that there was another sect, essentially Deva or devil worshippers, and they were suppressed by the Emperor Xerxes. That caused them to emigrate into what we call modern-day Turkey, Anatolia, and they were the influence on the Greco-Roman religion of Mithra or Mithraism. The worship of evil was disguised by the Magi through their veneration of Mithras, the Persian species of the dying god, worshipped in India as Mithra, which the Magi reintroduced into Zoroastrianism. According to Geoffrey Burton Russell, in his effort to move toward monotheism, Zarathustra emphasized the power of Ahura Mazda to the point of ignoring Ahura Mithra, and we have no idea what the prophet thought of this deity. His followers restored Mithras to power, assimilating him to Mazda and worshipping him as a manifestation of the god of light. But apparently the unregenerate Deva worshippers, untouched by Zarathustra's reforms, also continued to worship Mithras, and some of the later Magi may have been drawn in this direction. So essentially, this deity Mithras is being pulled in two different directions. He's being reformed at one time towards like the good god, the Ahura Mazda type god, but he's also remaining by the Deva worshippers, the kind of evil entity. So he's being split. Mithras was assimilated by the Magi to the Babylonian sun god Shamash, who was also identified with Bel. Mithras was one of three gods adopted from the trinity of a father, mother, and sun god, worshipped by the Babylonians and identified with the sun, moon, and Venus, which the Magi assimilated to their own ancient Persian deities. According to Cumont, Babylon, being the winter residence of the sovereigns, was the seat of a numerous body of official clergy called Magi, who sat in authority over the indigenous priests. The prerogatives that the imperial protocol guaranteed to this official clergy could not render them exempt from the influence of the powerful sacerdotal caste that flourished beside them. The erudite and refined theology of the Chaldeans was thus superposed on the primitive Mazdean belief, which was rather a congress of traditions than a well-established body of definite dogmas. The legends of the two religions were assimilated, and their divinities were identified, and the Semitic worship of the stars, or astrology, the monstrous fruit of long-continued scientific observations, became amalgamated to the nature myths of the Uranians. Ahura Mazda was confounded with Bel, who reigned over the heavens. Anahita was likened to Ishtar, who presided over the planet Venus, while Mithra became the sun Shamash. More syncretisms. The earliest indication of the worship of the god Mithras among the Persians, is found in a sculptured tablet above the tomb of Darius I, who took the throne in 521 BC, in which the symbols of Mazda and of Mithra were placed in equally conspicuous positions, a practice that was continued by his successors. The fact that Persians worshipped a god named Mithra was known to Herodotus, who mentioned that Zeus in their system is the whole circle of the heavens, and they sacrifice to him from the tops of mountains. They also worship the sun, moon, the earth, fire, water, and winds, which are the four elements, which are their only original deities. It was later that they learned from the Assyrians and Arabians the cult of Uranian Aphrodite. The Assyrian name for Aphrodite is Mylitta, the Arabian Alilat, the Persian Mithra. Great. Again, the Aphrodite or the Venus Sun Moon complex is a little confusing. They're all kind of different versions of the same. Okay. On to Saturn. David provides actually a link here to a YouTube video from Timeline with the BBC about the blood-curdling sacrifices of the Phoenicians. Here you see a child being sacrificed to Moloch or Baal. I think it's Moloch. Baal, I think, was like their good version, and Moloch the bad, I believe. Okay. Saturn. I believe this is the end of this first volume. Sorry, not volume. Part 1 of Volume 1. There's actually 20 parts to Volume 1. Okay, but this is the end of it, so this will be the end of the video soon after this section, and we'll do the next part, which is Ancient Greece, in the next video. Continuing. The Bible makes numerous condemnations of the ancient Israelites sacrificing their children to another derivation of Baal called Moloch, who was associated with Saturn. As god of the underworld, the dying god was also a chthonic deity or god of the underworld and therefore typically associated with evil. According to the principles of apotropaic magic, the good god was appeased with good sacrifices, while the evil god required evil ones. The most evil sacrifice was the killing of a child. Rabbinical tradition depicted Moloch as a bronze statue heated with fire into which the victims were thrown. This has been associated with reports by Clitarchus, Diodorus, Siculus, and Plutarch, who all mention the burning of children as an offering to Cronus or Saturn, that is to Baal Hamon, the chief god of Carthage. Cronus, also spelled Kronos or Kronos, in ancient Greek religion, is a male deity who is worshipped by the pre-Hellenic population of Greece. In Attica, his festival, the Cronia, celebrated the harvest and resembled the Roman Saturnalia. Scholars have now come to acknowledge the striking similarities between Mesopotamian mythology and the works of the greatest of the Greek poets, Hesiod and Homer. Hesiod believed to belong to the 8th century BC, was the author of the Theogony, a systemization of early Greek mythology. Hesiod's Theogony outlines a usurper myth, an account of how Zeus became superior following a war against Kronos and the Titans. According to Hesiod, Kronos was the son of Uranus and Gaia, being the youngest of the 12 Titans. After castrating his father on the advice of his mother, he became the king of the Titans. David's just going through some basic Greek mythology here, trying to show you how it's syncretized to the mythologies we were just speaking about, and kind of introducing us to his next section, which is going to be ancient Greece. After castrating his father, on the advice of his mother, he became the king of the Titans. He took his consort, his sister Rhea, who bore by him Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, and Poseidon, all of whom he swallowed because his own parents had warned that he would be overthrown by his own child. When Zeus was born, however, Rhea hid him in Crete, and when he grew up, Zeus forced Kronos to disgorge his brothers and sisters, waged war on Kronos, and was victorious. According to one tradition, the period of Kronos' rule was a golden age. Here's the painting by Peter Paul Rubens of Saturn devouring his son. Very famous painting. Interesting with the 3 stars up there. The motif that the present rule of the gods came to power by overthrowing an older one is especially Near Eastern. According to M.L. West, Hesiod's integration of a dynastic history of this sort with a divine genealogy started from the beginning of things and ending with the king of the gods established in glory has its closest parallel in Enuma Elish, a poem of similar length to the Theogony. The myth of Kronos swallowing his children was compared to the Carthaginian worship of Moloch or Saturn by Diodorus. Among the Carthaginians there was a brazen statue of Saturn, putting forth the palms of his hands, bending in such a manner towards the earth as that the boy who was laid upon them, in order to be sacrificed, should slip off and so fall down headlong into a deep, fiery furnace. Hence it is probable that Euripides took what he fabulously relates concerning the sacrifice in Taurus, where he introduces Iphigenia, asking Orestes this question, "But what sepulchre will me dead receive? Shall the gulf of sacred fire me have?" The ancient fable likewise that is common among all the Grecians, that Saturn devoured his own children, seems to be confirmed by this law among the Carthaginians. Like the defeat of Tiamat by Bel, Zeus with his thunderbolts defeats the monster Typhon and has him flung to Tartarus, and Zeus is proclaimed king of the gods. The Titans correspond to the Anakim, or the Anunnaki of the Enuma Elish, and to the Hittite former gods, the same term used by Hesiod to refer to the Titans, which are 12 in number, the same quantity as the Titans. So these things are very well syncretized. When the Titan Prometheus stole the fire of the gods, wishing to impart to man what was forbidden to him, like the Bible's Satan, Zeus finally punished the Titans for their insolence by sending the flood. Again, similar to the Bible. Of the connection between the myth of Deucalion, the Greek flood hero, and Noah, according to M.L. West, this Greek myth cannot be independent of the flood story that we know from Sumerian, Akkadian, and Hebrew sources, especially from Atrahasis, the 11th tablet of the Gilgamesh epic, and the Old Testament. Good, and here David lists his sources for this chapter, and that was chapter 1 of volume 1, I should say, Babylon. In the next video, we'll cover ancient Greece, taking our next little step through history of secret societies, occultism, etc. So I thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.